What if the future could be written before it happened? Not by God, not by fate, but by a man with a pen and a broken heart. On a foggy October night in 1895, a small brown package arrived at 221B Baker Street. No name, no sender, just a diary, and inside it, a murder that hadn't happened yet. By the time Sherlock Holmes finished reading the first page, the clock was already ticking toward a man's death. By the time he closed the book, 4 more names were waiting. This is not a story about catching a killer. It is a story about a mind clever enough to make Sherlock Holmes doubt the one thing he trusted more than anything else in the world, his own free will. Some cases test a detective's skill. This one tested his soul. Chapter 1. The Unbidden Prophet. I have written down many strange cases in my years beside Sherlock Holmes, but none of them ever frightened me the way this one did. Not because of blood, or knives, or midnight chases. It frightened me because it was quiet. It crept in like the fog itself, slow, cold, and impossible to stop. It was a wet October evening in the year 1895. I had come to Baker Street to share a simple dinner with my old friend. Holmes sat by the fire, his violin resting on his knee, though he was not playing it. He seemed restless, the way he always was when London had grown too quiet for his liking. "Watson," he said without looking up, "you have the look of a man who thinks the world has become dull." "I confess, I was thinking the very opposite," I answered, warming my hands by the fire. "London seems calm tonight." "Calm," Holmes repeated, and something in his voice made me uneasy. Calm is often the mask that chaos wears just before it strikes. I had barely time to smile at this when Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a small brown package. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed it to Holmes. "This came by messenger, sir. The boy would not say who sent it. He simply placed it in my hands and ran off into the fog." Holmes turned the package over. There was no name upon it, no return address, only his own name written in a careful, old-fashioned hand. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street. "How curious," he murmured, and I saw the light return to his grey eyes. That spark he always got when something new and strange had entered his world. He opened it carefully. Inside was a small leather diary, its cover worn and dark with age. Holmes opened the first page and began to read aloud. "Tonight, Sir Richard Ashdown will die in his study, a glass of French cognac in his hand, struck down by a blow he will not see coming. The hour will be 9:30. The room will smell of cigar smoke and rain." I laughed, though I am not sure why. Perhaps it was nervousness. Some sort of joke, surely, Holmes. "A prank from one of your rivals at Scotland Yard." Holmes did not laugh. He was staring at the small clock upon the mantel. It was 20 minutes past 9. "Watson," he said slowly, "do you know a man named Sir Richard Ashdown? The name is familiar. A retired judge, I believe. Lives near Portman Square." Holmes rose at once, reaching for his coat. "Then we have very little time. If this thing speaks even a grain of truth." I confess, I still believed it was nonsense. Some cruel joke meant to frighten an old detective into chasing shadows. But Holmes's face had changed. There was no amusement in it now. Only a sharp, cold focus I had seen only a handful of times before. We took a cab through the fog, the horse's hooves striking the wet stones like a slow, steady drumbeat. Neither of us spoke. I watched Holmes read the diary entry again and again, his lips moving silently as he memorized every word. When we reached the Ashdown house, all the windows were dark except one, the study, on the ground floor, where a single lamp burned behind heavy curtains. Holmes knocked upon the door with great urgency. When no one answered, he tried the handle. It was unlocked. We entered to find the house silent, too silent. My heart was already sinking before we reached the study door. Sir Richard Ashdown lay upon the floor beside his desk. His hand still held a glass, now shattered, the amber liquid soaking into the carpet beside him. His face wore an expression not of pain, but of pure surprise, as though the last thing he saw was something he could never have imagined. I checked for a pulse, though I already knew what I would find. He has been dead perhaps 10 minutes, Holmes, no more. Holmes did not answer. He was staring at the clock upon the mantel, which read 25 minutes past 9. The diary said 9:30, I whispered. The diary was wrong by 5 minutes, Holmes said quietly. Or we arrived 5 minutes too late to see it happen. Either way, Watson, someone knew this man would die tonight, in this room, in this manner, before it happened. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold October air. A warning, then. Someone tried to help us stop it. Or someone wished us to watch it happen and feel powerless, Holmes said. His voice had grown strange, quiet, almost fearful, though I had never known Holmes to fear anything in this world. Watson, I do not like this. I do not like this at all. He knelt beside the body and began his examination, checking the hands, the wound at the temple, the angle of the fall. But even as he worked, I saw that his mind was elsewhere, turning over and over the terrible question that the diary had planted in his thoughts. How could anyone know the future? It was then that Holmes opened the diary once more, his fingers trembling ever so slightly, a thing I had never before witnessed in this cold, controlled man. He turned to the next page. There was a second entry, and this one had not been there when we first read the diary at Baker Street. The second shall fall within the hour, in a house near Kensington, where the fireplace burns but no one weeps. Holmes looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before. Not curiosity, not excitement, but genuine fear. Watson, he said, his voice low, we must go, now. There is not a moment to lose. Chapter 2. The Blood-Stained Equation. The cab rattled through the fog toward Kensington, as though the horse itself understood the urgency in Holmes's voice. I watched my friend beside me, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on nothing, his mind clearly racing through possibilities that made no sense to a rational man. Holmes, I said at last, unable to bear the silence, surely there is some trick here. A man cannot know the future. Perhaps someone plans these deaths and simply writes them down beforehand, timing the diary's delivery to match. That was my first thought as well, Holmes replied, not turning to look at me. But consider this, Watson. The diary was delivered to our door before Sir Richard died. If the killer wrote that entry beforehand and planned the timing, then either he trusted the murder to happen exactly on schedule, in exact detail, down to the cognac in the man's hand, or he is not predicting the murder at all, I finished, understanding dawning slowly and unpleasantly. He is describing it, as though he already knows precisely what will happen, because he has already decided it. Precisely, Holmes said, which raises a far darker question. Not who will die next, but who controls what happens at all. I did not like the sound of that. Neither, I think, did Holmes, though he would never have admitted it so plainly. We reached the Kensington address just as the church bells struck 10. It was a quiet street of well-kept townhouses, the kind where nothing terrible ever seemed to happen. But the diary had said, a house where the fireplace burns, but no one weeps, and as we approached one particular door, I saw why. The curtains were open, a fire burned cheerfully in the front room, and through the window I could see a woman lying still upon the settee, as though asleep. Holmes did not wait for an answer at the door. He forced it open with his shoulder, and we rushed inside. The woman was dead. There was no blood, no wound that I could see at first glance. Her face was peaceful, almost gentle, as though she had simply drifted off to sleep and never woken. "No struggle," Holmes murmured, kneeling beside her. "No sign of forced entry. No wound upon her body that I can find. Watson, examine her, if you please." I did as he asked, my medical training taking over where my fear left off. I found no injury, no bruising, nothing that spoke of violence. "Holmes, I cannot find a cause of death. Not yet, at least. It is as though she simply stopped living." Holmes was staring at the fireplace with great intensity. "Watson, look here. The fire is burning cleanly, evenly, but see how the coal has been arranged. Not the natural way a fire burns down over hours. Someone built this fire recently, and built it with unusual care." I looked closer and saw what he meant. The coals were arranged almost like a pattern, deliberate and strange. "And here," Holmes continued, pointing to the small side table beside the settee, "a teacup, half full, gone cold. But see the residue at the bottom, a faint white powder that does not belong to tea alone." He lifted the cup carefully and smelled it, his brow furrowing. "Bitter almonds faintly. Watson, I believe we may be dealing with poison, though a rare and carefully chosen one." It was then that I noticed the diary resting upon the mantel above the fireplace, exactly where it had not been before. My blood ran cold. "Holmes, it was not here when we entered." Holmes turned sharply and looked at the small book. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I have ever heard. "Someone is here," I whispered, "or was here, only moments ago." Holmes crossed the room and threw open the back door, which led to a small garden, and beyond it, a low wall separating the property from the street behind. There was no one in sight, only the fog, thick and unmoving, as though it too was hiding something. He returned to the mantel and picked up the diary with great care, as though it might burn him. He opened it to the next page. "There is no third entry yet, Watson. Only silence. The equation is not finished." I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. "Holmes, it speaks to you directly now. It knows your name. It knows I am here." "Yes," Holmes said quietly, closing the book. His face, usually so composed, so certain, had gone pale in the firelight. "Someone has been watching us since the moment that first package arrived. Someone who knew we would come here. Someone who left this diary not as a clue, Watson, but as a message." "A message saying what?" Holmes looked at me, and for the first time in all our years together, I saw genuine uncertainty in his eyes. "That we are no longer investigating a murder," he said slowly. "We are being invited into something else entirely. A game, perhaps, or a lesson. I do not yet know which frightens me more." Outside, the church bells tolled 11 times, slow and heavy through the fog, as though counting down toward something none of us could yet see. We stood there a long while in that quiet, firelit room, beside a woman who had died without a mark upon her, holding a small brown diary that seemed to know our names, our movements, our very thoughts before we thought them. "Come, Watson," Holmes said at last, tucking the diary into his coat. "We must return to Baker Street. I have much to think about, and I fear the night is far from finished with us." As we stepped back out into the fog, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere in that vast, sleeping city, someone was watching us go, and smiling. Chapter 3. The Grammar of a Criminal Mind. Baker Street welcomed us back with its familiar warmth, though nothing about that night felt familiar anymore. Mrs. Hudson had left a small fire burning, and Holmes sank into his chair by it, the diary held tightly in his hands, as though it might vanish if he let it go. For a long while, He said nothing at all. He simply stared into the flames, turning the small brown book over and over between his fingers. I watched him, worried, for I had rarely seen my friend so shaken. "Holmes," I said gently, "you have not slept in 2 days." "Perhaps. Sleep is for men who do not have a puzzle waiting for them," he snapped, though not unkindly. Then, more softly, he added, "Forgive me, Watson. I am not myself tonight." "No one would be themselves, faced with such a thing," I said. "A diary that writes itself. A killer who leaves no mark. It is enough to unsettle any man." Holmes looked up at me, and something in his eyes had changed. Not fear exactly, but a fierce, burning curiosity that I recognized well. It was the look he wore when a case had finally caught hold of him completely. "You are right about one thing, Watson," he said. "It unsettles me, but an unsettled mind is a mind that has stopped thinking clearly. I must think clearly now, more than ever." He rose and crossed to his small chemistry table, setting the diary down beneath the lamp. He took out his magnifying glass and began to examine the pages with great care. "Tell me what you see, Holmes," I said, settling into my chair to watch. "The handwriting," he began, "is old-fashioned, careful, almost too careful. Every letter is formed with equal weight and spacing, as though the writer were following a rule rather than simply writing. This is not the hand of a passionate man, Watson. This is the hand of someone trained in mathematics, or perhaps architecture, someone who thinks in straight lines and exact measurements. A mathematician who kills," I said, unable to keep the doubt from my voice. "Perhaps not a killer at all," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. "Notice the language, Watson. There is no anger in these words, no pleasure in death, no cruelty for its own sake. Listen again to how he described Sir Richard's death, struck down by a blow he would not see coming. It reads like a scientific observation, not a boast." He turned the page and held it beneath the lamp. "And here, smell this, Watson." I leaned close and caught a strange, sharp scent rising from the paper. Ink, certainly, but something else beneath it, almost metallic. "A rare compound," Holmes said, "used in certain specialist inks from decades past. Not the sort of ink one buys at any ordinary stationer's shop. This ink was made for someone particular, likely a scholar, or someone connected with an old and respected institution." He set the magnifying glass down and rubbed his eyes, exhaustion finally showing through his excitement. "Whoever wrote this diary, Watson, is no common criminal. He is educated, precise. He has spent years, perhaps decades, learning to think in a way most men never do. And he wants me, specifically, to understand this about him. But why you, Holmes? Why not the police? Why not the newspapers, if he wishes the world to see his cleverness?" Holmes turned to me, and his expression was grave. "That, my dear Watson, is the question that troubles me most. He does not wish to be admired by the world. He wishes to be understood by one man alone, and that is a far more dangerous thing to wish for." We sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly, the fog pressing against the windows outside. I could see Holmes's mind working, turning the small book over again and again, searching for something more. "There is a marking here," he said suddenly, holding a page up to the light, very faint, a watermark within the paper itself. He crossed to the window, holding the page against the pale grey light from outside. "There, do you see it, Watson? A small symbol, a circle, with a single line through it." I peered closely, but could make out only a faint shadow within the paper's fibers. "I cannot say I understand its meaning." "Nor can I, not yet," Holmes admitted. "But I have seen paper marked this way only once before, in the reading rooms of the British Museum, where certain rare documents are stored under special conditions. If I am not mistaken, this paper came from a supplier who serves scholars and researchers, a very small, very particular circle of men." He set the book down and reached for his coat once more. "Holmes, it is nearly 2 in the morning," I protested. "Then we shall arrive at the museum just as it opens," he said, with the faintest ghost of a smile. "Come, Watson. I do not intend to sleep until I understand who has decided that I am worth writing to." I confess I did not share his eagerness. I was tired and frightened and troubled by a growing sense that we were being led somewhere rather than discovering it ourselves. But I have never once, in all our years together, let Holmes walk into danger alone, and I was not about to begin that night. Chapter 4. The Society of the Cog. The British Museum, when we arrived some hours later, wore the strange stillness of early morning, the great stone building rising out of the fog like a sleeping giant, its columns pale and ghostly in the weak autumn light. Holmes moved through its halls with the quiet urgency of a man who has found the scent of something important. We made our way to the records office, where an elderly clerk, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, reluctantly agreed to help us search the paper supply records. It took the better part of an hour, but at last Holmes gave a small, satisfied sound and held up a yellowed ledger page. "Here, Watson, a special order of paper, 5 years past, bearing that very same watermark, made for a private customer, a Professor Alistair Finch." "Finch," I repeated. The name means nothing to me, nor did it mean much to me, until this moment, Holmes said, his eyes scanning further down the page. "But see here, the order was never collected in person. It was delivered to an address near Oxford, to a man once celebrated, and then, it seems, entirely forgotten." We thanked the clerk and made our way back out into the London morning, the fog beginning at last to lift. Holmes was quiet during the cab ride, deep in thought, and I did not press him. I had learned long ago that silence was often the truest sign that his mind was working hardest. It was not until later that afternoon, after a few hours of much-needed rest, that our next lead arrived, quite unexpectedly, in the form of a visitor. Mrs. Mary Quince was announced by Mrs. Hudson with some hesitation, as though unsure whether the pale, dignified woman waiting below truly wished to enter such a place as 221B Baker Street. But when she came up the stairs, I saw at once that here was no delicate, weeping widow. Her back was straight, her eyes sharp and clear. Though shadowed with grief, she did not try to hide. "Mr. Holmes," she said, taking the seat he offered, "I understand you are investigating my husband's death." Holmes leaned forward with interest. "Your husband was Mr. Edmund Quince," she said. "You will forgive me, Mr. Holmes, but I read of the murder in the newspaper this morning, and something has troubled me deeply since I heard how he died. The police believe it was a robbery gone wrong. I do not believe this for a moment." "Why not, Mrs. Quince?" She hesitated, folding her gloved hands carefully in her lap. "My husband kept many old friendships from his university days. There was a small group of gentlemen, they called themselves the Order of the Cog, who met to discuss mathematics, philosophy, questions of fate and free will. It sounds harmless enough, does it not? But in recent years, my husband grew troubled by it. He spoke of a man named Finch, once brilliant, who had suffered some terrible tragedy and had changed. Edmund said Finch had begun to speak of things that frightened him, strange ideas about destiny, about proving that nothing in life happens by chance. I felt a chill pass through me at the name, spoken now for the second time that day. "Did your husband fear this man?" Holmes asked quietly. "He did not say so directly," Mrs. Quince replied, "but in these last weeks he grew quiet, distracted. He began locking his study at night, which he had never done before. And 2 days before he died, Mr. Holmes, his private papers went missing from that very study. I do not know who took them, but I know he never went anywhere without a key, and that key never left his side." Holmes was very still, his eyes fixed on her with the intensity I had come to know so well. "Mrs. Quince, would you be willing to provide me with a list of the members of this Order of the Cog?" "I have already prepared one," she said, drawing a folded paper from her bag, "in case you asked." Holmes took it and scanned it quickly, and I saw his expression change, a flicker of something sharp and urgent crossing his face. "Watson," he said, holding the list toward me, his finger pressed against one particular name, circled faintly in pencil. "Look here." I leaned closer and read the name he indicated. A name still very much alive, according to the notation beside it, and one that filled me with dread the moment I understood its meaning. "Holmes," I said slowly, "this man is on the diary's list of victims, is he not?" "He is," Holmes said grimly, rising from his chair and reaching for his coat once more. "And according to my count, Watson, he has perhaps 3 days left to live, unless we can reach him first." Mrs. Quince rose as well, her composed face finally showing a flicker of fear. "Then you believe there is truth to this? That someone means to kill again?" "I believe, Mrs. Quince," Holmes said grimly, "that someone has already decided exactly how it will happen. Our task now is not merely to stop a murder, it is to understand a mind so patient, so precise, that it can plan death the way other men plan a garden, and to do so before it plants its next terrible seed." We left Baker Street within the hour, the fog rolling back in around us like a curtain closing on the first act of some terrible play, and I could not help but feel, as our cab rattled through the darkening streets, that we were no longer simply chasing a killer. We were being led, quite deliberately, towards something far stranger and far more dangerous than either of us yet understood. Chapter 5. The Architect's Blueprint. We found Mr. Jonathan Henderson's home just as the light was beginning to fade. A tall, narrow house near Russell Square, its windows warm with lamplight, its garden neat and well tended even in the last days of autumn. Holmes had sent word ahead, and a constable stood at the gate, looking rather pleased with himself at being trusted with such an important task. "All quiet here, Mr. Holmes," he reported. "No visitors since noon, and Mr. Henderson himself is inside, safe as houses." "Safe," Holmes repeated, and I did not like the way he said the word, as though tasting something bitter. We were shown into a bright conservatory at the rear of the house, glass walls letting in the last grey light of the day, filled with potted ferns and flowering plants that Mr. Henderson, it seemed, tended with great pride. He was a cheerful, round-faced man of perhaps 50, and he laughed when Holmes explained, as gently as he could, the reason for our visit. "A diary that predicts my death. Mr. Holmes, I have not felt so alive in years. Come, sit, both of you. I shall have tea brought in, and you may watch over me all evening if it eases your minds." Holmes did not smile. His eyes moved constantly around the room, the plants, the furniture, the doors, the windows, as though searching for a danger he could not yet name. We sat. Tea was brought. Mr. Henderson spoke cheerfully of his garden, his roses, his prize orchids, seeming entirely unbothered by the two grim-faced men watching him so closely. I confess that, as the hour grew later and nothing happened, I too began to relax, to think that perhaps this time we had truly won, that our presence alone had been enough to stop whatever terrible plan had been set in motion. I was wrong, and I have never forgiven myself for that small, foolish comfort. It happened so quietly that I did not understand what I was seeing until it was already too late. Mr. Henderson, mid-sentence, praising a particular white flower on the shelf beside him, suddenly stopped speaking, His hand rose to his chest. His face, so full of color a moment before, went terribly pale. "Henderson!" Holmes was on his feet in an instant. But even as he crossed the room, the man had slumped sideways in his chair, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. I rushed to his side, my medical training taking hold. But even as I worked, I felt his pulse growing weak, then weaker, then still. There had been no knife, no poison in his cup, no stranger in the room. And yet he was gone. For a long moment none of us spoke. The only sound was the soft dripping of water from a nearby plant, and the distant, cheerful sound of a hansom cab passing on the street outside, entirely unaware of the tragedy that had just unfolded behind the glass. "Holmes," I said at last, my voice unsteady, "there is no wound, no sign of poison in his cup, nothing he ate that we did not also see him eat safely before. I do not understand how this happened." Holmes did not answer at once. He was staring at the white flower Mr. Henderson had been admiring only moments before. A beautiful, delicate bloom, its petals pale as bone in the dim light. "Oleander," Holmes said quietly. "The flower. Do you not know it, Watson? A common enough garden plant, but deadly if handled or breathed in the wrong way, particularly in an enclosed space such as this. The pollen alone, in sufficient quantity, can stop a man's heart within minutes." He knelt and examined the pot closely. "See here. This plant was moved. Recently, the soil is disturbed, and the pot has been placed closer to his chair than it was when we first sat down." I stared at him in horror. Then someone was here, in this room, while we sat and drank tea not 3 feet away. "No," Holmes said slowly, and I saw something close to despair cross his face for the first time since this terrible case began. "No one needed to be here at all, Watson. This is what I failed to understand. I was waiting for a man with a knife, or a vial of poison, or a gun. I was watching the doors, the windows, every person who came near. But the weapon was already in the room before we ever arrived. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be moved 3 feet closer to its victim." He rose, his face pale, with something I had never before seen in him. Genuine self-doubt. "I failed him, Watson. I sat in this room and watched a man die, and I did not see it happening because I was looking for the wrong kind of danger entirely. I did not know what to say to comfort him, for in truth, I shared his horror. We had come to protect this man, and instead we had become witnesses to a murder so quiet, so patient, that it had unfolded directly beneath our watchful eyes." Holmes crossed to where the diary lay upon a side table, for it had appeared there too, as it always did, though neither of us had seen who placed it. He opened it with hands that were, for once, not entirely steady. He read the newest entry in silence, then looked up at me, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Watson, the ink of this new entry is different from the last two. Look closely." I did, and saw what he meant. The earlier entries were written in the same careful, formal hand, but this latest one, describing tonight's death, was written in ink of a slightly different shade, the strokes just faintly less precise. "Two authors," Holmes murmured. "One who plans, one who acts. And Watson." He turned the page, his finger trembling slightly as it came to rest upon the final entry in the diary, the one describing a fifth and final event. This last entry is written once more in the first ink. The same hand that wrote of Sir Richard's death. Whoever writes the beginning and the end of this terrible story, Watson, is the same person. And I very much fear, from what this final entry describes, that the ending concerns not a stranger, but myself. Chapter 6. The Silence of the Reading Room. We returned to the British Museum the following morning, though this time Holmes led us not to the records office, but deeper into the building, toward the great reading room beneath its famous dome. I had been inside that room only once before, and it had struck me then as it struck me again that morning, as one of the strangest places in all of London. A vast circle of desks spread out beneath a domed ceiling so high above that it seemed almost like standing beneath the sky itself, except that this sky was made of iron and glass, and the silence beneath it was heavier than any silence found beneath the real one. Rows of scholars sat bent over their books, none of them speaking, none of them even seeming to breathe too loudly, as though the room itself demanded a kind of reverent stillness. Holmes moved through it like a man walking through a church, his footsteps deliberately soft. "This is where he comes to think," Holmes murmured to me. "A man like Finch, if my instincts are correct, would find comfort in a room built entirely on order, on structure, on the idea that all human knowledge can be catalogued, numbered, and understood." We were led by a clerk to a small archive room where old academic papers were kept, and there Holmes began his search in earnest. For nearly 2 hours, he read through faded lectures, old university records, and forgotten philosophical papers, while I sat beside him, growing increasingly restless in the oppressive silence. At last, Holmes gave a soft exclamation and held up a bundle of papers, tied with fading string. "Here, Watson, a philosophical treatise, submitted some years ago and never published. The author, Professor Alistair Finch." He read aloud, quietly, so as not to disturb the room's heavy stillness. The words were strange and troubling, long passages arguing that every human choice was merely the final link in a chain of causes stretching back to the beginning of time, that free will was nothing but a comforting illusion, that a mind clever enough could, in theory, predict any human action if it understood every cause behind it. "He believes there is no such thing as choice," I whispered, unsettled by the coldness of the words, "that we are all simply following a path already written for us." "Yes," Holmes said quietly, "and somewhere in these papers, Watson, I believe we shall find the reason he came to believe such a terrible thing." We found it a little further on, a letter, tucked between the pages, addressed to a Dr. Silas Thorpe, though it appeared never to have been sent. In it, Finch wrote of a fire, years before, that had taken his wife and young daughter while he was away at a lecture, arguing, of all things, about the nature of chance and probability. He wrote of how he had once believed the universe unfolded through pure accident, until that night convinced him otherwise. He wrote that he could no longer bear the thought that his family's death had been meaningless, random, without cause. And so he had devoted the rest of his life to proving that nothing was random at all, that even the cruelest tragedy was simply one more link in an unbreakable chain that could, with enough genius, be traced, predicted, and understood. I felt a deep and unexpected sorrow reading those words. Whatever terrible things this man had done, I could not help but feel the weight of the grief that had driven him to it. "Holmes," I said softly, "this is not the letter of a monster. It is the letter of a broken man trying desperately to make sense of an unbearable loss." "I fear you are right, Watson," Holmes replied, and there was something strange in his voice, not quite sympathy, but something close to recognition, as though he saw in Finch's grief some small reflection of his own relentless need to find order in a chaotic world. "And that, I think, is precisely why he has chosen me. He does not wish to defeat a stranger. He wishes to convert a kindred mind." It was as Holmes gathered the papers to return them to the archivist that something caught his eye. A small, worn library card, tucked among the records, used to sign out certain restricted documents. He picked it up, and I watched the color drain slowly from his face as he read it. "Holmes, what is it?" He did not answer at once. He simply held the card toward me, and I read, with a chill spreading through my chest, a signature written in careful, familiar handwriting. A signature I recognized instantly, for I had seen it 1,000 times upon letters, notes, and case files. It was Holmes's own signature. Dated 1 week before Sir Richard Ashdown's death. "Holmes," I said carefully, "surely there is some explanation. A forgery, perhaps, or—" "I do not remember signing this, Watson," Holmes said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, in the way it always did when he was fighting to hide fear beneath calm reason. "I do not remember visiting this room at all during that week, and yet here is my own hand, my own name, proving that I was here." He set the card down carefully, as though it might shatter, and for a long moment he simply stared at that vast, silent dome above us, its circular ceiling curving endlessly overhead, like the walls of some enormous, inescapable trap. "There is a 5th entry in that diary, Watson," he said at last, very softly, "and I begin to understand, with growing dread, precisely what it intends to describe. It is not a murder at all. It is a moment where I am meant to look at evidence exactly like this, and begin to doubt everything I have ever believed about my own free will." I did not know what to say. I had never in all our years together seen Sherlock Holmes afraid. But standing there beneath that great, silent dome, surrounded by the whispered breathing of scholars, and the terrible weight of his own signature staring back at him from a card he could not remember signing, I saw fear in my friend's eyes for the very first time. And I confess, dear reader, that I felt it too. Chapter 7. The Watson Variable. I did not like the way Holmes looked when we returned to Baker Street that evening. He sat by the fire without speaking, the diary open upon his knee, reading and rereading Finch's philosophical papers as though searching for some flaw in the argument that would set his mind at ease. But no such flaw seemed to present itself, and with each passing hour I watched my dearest friend sink further into a silence that frightened me more than any villain we had ever faced. "Holmes," I said finally, unable to bear it any longer, "you must eat something. You must rest. This is not like you." "What is like me, Watson?" he said, not looking up. "I have spent my whole life believing that with enough observation, enough reason, a man could understand anything, predict anything, given sufficient information. Is that not, in its own way, precisely what Finch believes? Perhaps I have been him all along, and simply called it detective work instead of philosophy." I confess his words struck me hard, for I had never before heard Holmes speak of himself with such despair. I sat across from him and said, as gently as I could, "Then let me ask you something, Holmes, as a doctor, and as your friend. When Mrs. Quince came to us with her list, what led you to trust her words, rather than dismiss her, as a grieving widow, imagining conspiracies?" He frowned slightly. "Her intelligence was evident. Her testimony was consistent." "No," I said. "It was her grief, Holmes. It was the way she spoke of her husband, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a man she loved and missed terribly. That is not something any equation could have predicted. That is something only a human heart could show us." Holmes looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, though he said nothing. I decided, that evening, to do the one thing I felt I could do that Holmes, in his current state, could not. I went to speak with the families of the victims myself. Not as a detective searching for clues, but simply as a man willing to listen. It was not easy work, nor pleasant. I sat with grieving widows and heartbroken children, heard stories of good men and flawed men, of kindnesses and cruelties both large and small. But slowly, patiently, over the course of 2 long days, a pattern began to emerge, one that even Holmes, in his focus upon ink and paper and mathematics, had not yet seen. Each victim, I learned, had once wronged Professor Finch, in some small, human way. Sir Richard Ashdown had, many years before, mocked Finch's philosophical theories publicly at a dinner, calling them the ravings of a broken mind. Edmund Quince had voted, quietly and without much thought, to expel Finch from the Order of the Cog after his breakdown, fearing his strange new ideas might embarrass the group. The woman in Kensington, I learned, had once been engaged to marry Finch before his tragedy, and had broken it off soon after, unable to bear his growing coldness. And Jonathan Henderson, cheerful and kind as he had seemed to us, had once used one of Finch's uncredited ideas in a paper of his own, taking praise that was never truly his to claim. I brought these findings back to Baker Street that evening, and for the first time in days, I saw something change in Holmes's face as he listened. "They are not random victims at all," he murmured, almost to himself. "They are each, in their own small way, a piece of his story. A causal chain, Watson, exactly as his philosophy describes, except the chain is not one of pure logic. It is one of grief and betrayal and small human failures that, added together, broke a man's heart completely." "Then his philosophy is not truly about mathematics at all," I said. "It is about pain, Holmes. He has simply dressed his suffering in the language of logic, because it is easier to bear a broken world that follows rules than one that simply happened to break him for no reason at all." Holmes was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, steadier, though still touched with sorrow. "You have done what I could not, Watson. I have spent days chasing ink and paper and philosophy, treating this case as though it were merely a puzzle of logic to be solved. But you went instead to the hearts of the people involved, and found the truth I was too blind to see." "It is not blindness, Holmes," I said. "It is simply a different kind of seeing. You see patterns. I see people. Perhaps, in this case, we needed both." Holmes nodded slowly, and for the first time since this terrible case began, I saw a flicker of his old determination returning to his eyes. "Then let us use both, my friend. Finch believes he has built a perfect equation, a chain of cause and effect that leads, inevitably, to my own surrender. But an equation, however perfect, can only account for what its author understands. And I do not believe Finch understands you at all, Watson. I do not believe his cold calculations have any place at all for something as irrational, as unpredictable, as simple human kindness." He rose from his chair with new purpose, crossing to his desk and beginning to write rapidly. "What are you planning, Holmes?" "I am going to give him what he does not expect," Holmes said, not looking up. "Not defiance, not fear. Something far more dangerous to a man who believes everything can be calculated in advance." "And what is that?" Holmes looked up at me, and for the first time in days, I saw the faintest ghost of his old sharp smile. "Surprise, Watson. I am going to surprise him." Chapter 8. The Architect Revealed. The days that followed were strange and quiet, filled with a tension I found difficult to bear. Holmes told the household, and even the police, that he had grown weary of the case, that he believed himself defeated, that he intended to set the matter aside entirely. I did not understand at first why he would say such a thing, until he explained it to me one grey afternoon, his voice low, as though even our own rooms might be listened to. "Watson, if Finch is watching us as closely as I believe he is, through Blackwood, or some other quiet eye we have not yet identified, then he must believe he has already won. A predictable man, Watson, is one who behaves exactly as expected. If I show despair, if I show surrender, then perhaps, just perhaps, he will grow careless in his certainty. And what do you intend to do instead?" "I intend," Holmes said, "to do the one thing his equation cannot predict. According to the diary, The final entry will occur at an address he has already chosen, at a time he has already decided. I do not intend to go there at all. I stared at him. Holmes, if you do not follow the diary's final entry, what will happen? I do not know, he admitted, and there was something almost like excitement beneath the gravity of his voice. And that, Watson, is precisely the point. Neither does Finch. For the first time since this began, I intend to act in a way that even the author of this terrible diary cannot foresee. That evening, in the grey hour just before dusk, Holmes sent me on an errand to fetch a particular book from a shop near the university, a task that seemed, at the time, entirely unrelated to our case, though I would later understand its true importance. When I returned, Holmes was gone, and a short note lay upon his desk in his familiar hand. Watson, I have gone to see Professor Finch myself, at his home. Do not follow. If I do not return by morning, take the diary to Inspector Gregson and tell him everything we have learned. I confess my heart nearly stopped reading those words. I paced our rooms for what felt like hours, torn between honoring my friend's wishes and my own desperate need to follow him into whatever danger he now faced alone. In the end, love and loyalty won over obedience, and I set out into the fog-choked evening, following the address Mrs. Quince had once given us for Professor Finch's quiet, forgotten home near the edge of the city. The house, when I found it, was small and plain, its garden overgrown, its windows dark, save for a single dim light burning somewhere within. I approached cautiously and found the front door unlocked, and I let myself inside, my heart pounding with every step. I found them in a small back study, lit only by a single gas lamp that cast long, trembling shadows across the walls. Professor Finch sat in a worn armchair, frail and thin, his once fine clothing hanging loosely from a body that grief and obsession had slowly worn away over the years. Holmes sat across from him, calm, composed, his coat still damp from the evening fog. "Ah, Watson," Finch said, turning toward the doorway with a strange, gentle smile that unsettled me more than any snarl of anger could have. "How fitting that you should arrive now. The variable returns to complete the equation." "Holmes," I said carefully, stepping into the room, "are you unharmed?" "Quite unharmed, Watson," Holmes said, his eyes never leaving Finch's pale, thin face. "The professor and I have simply been discussing philosophy." Finch chuckled softly, a dry and papery sound. "You came earlier than the diary predicted, Mr. Holmes." I confess, that surprised me a little. But no matter. I knew, in my heart, that you would come here eventually. A mind like yours could not resist understanding, even if the truth it found here was one you did not wish to hear. "Tell him then," Holmes said quietly. "Tell Watson what you have told me." Finch's eyes brightened with something almost like joy. "It is quite simple, Doctor. 5 years ago, I lost everything I loved to nothing more than pure, meaningless chance. A spark, a gust of wind, a fire that took my wife and my daughter while I sat lecturing on the very nature of probability itself. I could not bear it, Doctor. I could not bear a universe so cruel, so careless, that it would take everything from me for no reason at all." His voice trembled, and for a moment, the frightening architect of 5 deaths looked simply like a broken old man, lost in grief, too large for any single heart to hold. "So I decided," he continued, "that if I could prove, truly prove, that nothing happens by chance, that every death, every tragedy, is simply one more link in an unbreakable chain of cause and effect, then perhaps I could finally make sense of my loss. Perhaps I could prove that even my family's death had a reason, a place, a purpose within some greater design." "And so you built your equation from the deaths of others," Holmes said, his voice quiet but firm. "You chose 5 people who had each, in some small way, wronged you, and you arranged their deaths to prove your terrible theory. I did not simply wish to prove it to myself, Mr. Holmes, Finch said, leaning forward with sudden intensity. I wished to prove it to you. You, who represent everything I once believed in. Reason, logic, the power of a brilliant mind to understand all things. I built this entire chain of events for you, Mr. Holmes, so that you too might finally see the truth I have come to know, that we are none of us truly free. We are simply following a path already written long before we ever knew it existed. He rose slowly from his chair and crossed to a small writing desk, from which he withdrew a final, blank leather diary, identical in every way to the one Holmes still carried, save that its pages were entirely empty. This is the final entry, Mr. Holmes, Finch said softly, holding it out toward my friend. I have left it blank, for it is not mine to write. It is yours. Read it, and you will understand at last that even your arrival here tonight, earlier than I predicted, was simply another link in the chain, one more inevitable step toward this very moment. I watched Holmes take the blank book in his hands, and my heart ached with fear for what this terrible night might yet demand of him. Chapter 9. The Unpredictable Man. The room was very quiet. Only the soft hiss of the gas lamp and the faint crackle of a small, dying fire broke the silence as Sherlock Holmes stood holding the blank diary in his hands, Professor Finch watching him with the eager, hopeful eyes of a man who believed, with his whole broken heart, that he was about to be understood at last. I stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to move, afraid that any sound might tip the balance of whatever terrible moment was unfolding before me. Write it, Mr. Holmes, Finch said softly. Write your surrender. Write that you understand now what I have always understood, that free will is a comforting lie we tell ourselves, that every choice you believe you are making was decided long before you were ever born. Prove to me that my equation is complete. Holmes looked down at the blank page for a long moment. I watched his face carefully, searching for some sign of what he intended to do, but his expression remained calm, unreadable, the way it always was in the final moments before he revealed some brilliant truth. Professor Finch, Holmes said at last, and his voice was gentle, gentler than I had ever heard it. I understand your grief. I understand it more than you might believe. I have spent my own life searching for order in chaos, for reason in senseless things. In many ways, you and I are not so different as you think. Finch's eyes lit with something like triumph. Then you agree. But there, Holmes interrupted, still gentle, though firmer now, is where you and I part ways forever. You believe that finding a pattern in suffering makes that suffering meaningful. I believe something quite different. I believe that meaning is not something we discover already written into the world. It is something we choose to create, moment by moment, through our own actions. He took the pen Finch had offered and, without hesitation, without fear, wrote a single line upon the blank page. Then he closed the diary and held it out toward the old professor. Read it, Holmes said quietly. Finch's hands trembled as he took the book and opened it, his eyes moving across the single sentence Holmes had written. I watched his face carefully and saw something crumble within it, not anger, but a deep, aching sorrow, as though a final hope he had carried for years had just been gently, irrevocably taken from him. I am Sherlock Holmes, he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper, and I write this of my own free will. You wished to prove that I would surrender to your equation, Professor, Holmes said softly. But an equation cannot account for a choice made freely, without cause, beyond the simple wish to make it. You built 5 deaths trying to prove that nothing is truly chosen. And yet here, in this small, ordinary sentence, I have chosen something you could never have predicted, no matter how many years you spent calculating it. Finch sank back into his chair, the diary slipping from his trembling hands to the floor. "Then it was all for nothing," he whispered. "All of it. My wife, my daughter. 5 more deaths, and I have proven nothing at all." "You have proven only your own suffering, Professor," Holmes said, kneeling now beside the broken old man, his voice softer still. "And I am deeply sorry for it. No one should endure what you have endured. But you cannot heal a wound by opening 5 more. You cannot answer a senseless tragedy with more senseless tragedy and call it meaning." It was then that I heard footsteps behind me in the hallway and turned to find Inspector Gregson and 2 constables entering the house, summoned, I would later learn, by a note Holmes had left with Mrs. Hudson before ever leaving Baker Street that evening. One more piece of his careful, unpredictable plan. Finch did not resist as they came to take him. He simply sat, small and frail in his worn chair, staring at nothing, as though the fight that had sustained him for 5 long years had finally, quietly, gone out of him entirely. As they led him toward the door, he paused beside Holmes and looked up at him with something almost like gratitude in his tired eyes. "You could have simply refused to write anything at all, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly. "That too would have been a kind of proof for you. Why did you choose to write instead?" Holmes considered this for a long moment before answering. "Because refusing to act is not freedom, Professor. It is only another kind of surrender. I wished to show you something true, not merely defeat your argument. I wished to show you that a man may act, freely and deliberately, even within a world that sometimes feels as though it has already decided everything for him." Finch nodded slowly, though I do not think, even then, that he fully believed it. He was led away into the fog, and I never saw him again, save once, many months later, in the quiet visiting room of an asylum for the criminally troubled, where Holmes and I paid him a single, solemn visit that I shall write of another time. Chapter 10. The Unwritten Conclusion. It was many days before Holmes spoke freely of that night, and even then, only to me, and only beside the familiar fire of our own sitting room, where the fog outside seemed, at last, a comfort rather than a threat. "I came very close to losing myself in his philosophy, Watson," he admitted quietly, turning his violin over in his hands without playing it. "For a time, I believed that if I could simply outthink him, outreason his equation, I would win. But that was precisely his trap. He did not wish to defeat me through violence. He wished me to fight him on his own terms, within his own cold logic, until I too believed there was no true choice left in the world." "And what changed your mind?" I asked, though I believed I already knew the answer. "You did," Holmes said simply, looking at me with an honesty he rarely allowed himself. "You went to the families, Watson, while I sat here buried in ink and philosophy. You found the human truth beneath his mathematics, that his victims were not simply symbols in an equation, but people who had hurt him, yes, but people whose deaths were also felt, deeply and painfully, by those who loved them. That truth, that grief, could never be captured in any equation, however elegant. It was you who reminded me that the world is not merely a chain of cause and effect, it is also a chain of love and loss and choice." I confess I felt my throat tighten at his words, for I had never before heard Holmes speak so openly of what I meant to him, nor so plainly admit that his brilliant mind alone had not been enough to save him from despair. "Holmes," I said softly, "I have followed you into more strange and terrible cases than I can easily count. But I confess, this one frightened me more than any other, because for the first time I feared it was not a villain who might defeat you, but an idea." "Ideas are often the most dangerous enemies of all, Watson," Holmes agreed quietly. "A man with a knife can be stopped by another man with courage. But an idea that convinces you your own courage means nothing. That is a far harder thing to fight. We sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire warm between us, the violin still resting untouched in Holmes's hands. At last, he lifted it and began to play, not the sharp, urgent melodies he often played while working through a difficult case, but something slower, gentler, almost tender. "What became of Blackwood?" I asked eventually, remembering the quiet, watchful butler who had served as Finch's silent eyes throughout the case. "Gregson found him not long after Finch's arrest," Holmes said, still playing softly. "A sad, lonely man himself, Watson, who had once owed Finch a great debt of kindness during his own darkest years, and who repaid it, tragically, by helping him carry out this terrible scheme. He will face trial, though I suspect the court will show him some mercy, given the truth of his involvement. And Finch himself?" Holmes's bow paused upon the strings. "He will not stand trial, Watson. The doctors who examined him agree he is not fit for it. He has been placed in a quiet asylum, where I am told he spends his days writing endless mathematical proofs that no one reads, still searching, I imagine, for the meaning he lost so many years ago in that terrible fire." I felt a deep sadness at this. For whatever darkness Finch had brought into the world, I could not forget the raw, unbearable grief that had driven him to it. "Do you think he will ever find peace, Holmes?" "I do not know," Holmes admitted. "Perhaps peace is not something that can be calculated or proven at all, Watson. Perhaps it is simply something we must choose to build, moment by moment, the same way I chose to write that single sentence in his blank diary." He set his violin down at last and looked at me with a small, tired smile. "I think, my friend, that I have learned something rather important from this terrible case, though I confess I am not entirely certain I can put it fully into words." "Try," I said gently. "I have always believed," Holmes said slowly, "that with enough observation, enough reason, a man might understand anything at all, might even predict the actions of other men, as surely as one predicts the fall of a stone dropped from a height. But I understand now that there is one thing no amount of reason can ever fully capture, Watson, and that is the simple, stubborn, beautiful unpredictability of human choice. Not even I, with all my training, could have predicted that you would spend 2 days sitting with grieving widows, listening to their sorrow, when I myself believed the answer lay only in ink and paper. And it was that choice, entirely your own, entirely unpredictable even to me, that saved us both in the end. I did not know what to say to this, and so I said nothing at all. I simply sat beside my oldest and dearest friend, in the warm, familiar glow of our fire, grateful beyond words that whatever darkness had tried to claim him that terrible autumn, it had not succeeded. Holmes rose after a while and walked to the window, looking out at the fog rolling softly over London's rooftops, silver and gentle in the evening light. "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data, Watson," he said quietly, echoing words I had heard him say many times before, though never with quite so much weight behind them. "But I think I have learned something new this week. It is a far greater mistake to let the data theorize for you, to let cold facts and clever patterns convince you that your own heart has no voice left in the matter." He turned back to me, and in the firelight I saw not the cold, brilliant machine that London so often believed him to be, but simply a man, tired, thoughtful, and deeply, quietly human. "I think, Watson," he said softly, "that I shall retire early tonight. It seems I have one more case to solve after all, and it may take rather longer than 5 days to finish." "And what case is that, Holmes?" He smiled then, a small, genuine, weary smile that I have carried with me in memory ever since. "The case of my own mind, Watson," he said. But I find, for the first time in a great while, that I am not afraid to begin it. Outside, the fog continued its slow, silent journey across the sleeping city. And within our small sitting room, the fire burned on, warm and steady, asking nothing of either of us but to simply sit, together, and be glad that we had found our way home.